Good evening, everyone. Again, I am Ibrahim Sundiata, a Specter Emeritus Professor at Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts. Previous Chair of History at Howard University, ex-member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And I have been doing a series of talks which hopefully, as we go on, will become a series of conversations with you, my friends and colleagues that are seeing this. And I hope that many of you will share this with your friends and colleagues and give me your feedback. A lot of the feedback is very good. And I'm hoping for some of the feedback, which is actually constructive criticism, because I give that all the time. Now, one of the things I want to talk about that struck me in Brazil is the idea of identity. Brazilians have identities which are different than U.S. identities, formed in a different historical way. Less than 5% of African captives went to the U.S., but they have a very strong identity, formed in a cauldron of caste relations in which they were completely and totally shut out from most of the life of the nation. And in Brazil, 30% of the African captives came. They were not, for much of the 17th and 18th, part of the 19th century, a minority. What does that mean? Well, they were not. You couldn't say, well, there's that little minority over there, that little group of people. And nor were they kept isolated like a plague bacillus, as if they were a vial of a dread disease, a kind of super COVID that might get out and corrupt the whole society, destroying it in the process. Prohibited from living where they wanted to, prohibited from having sex with whom they wanted to. In Brazil, the gap between the rich and poor is one of the greatest in the world. Brazil has huge class inequities. And at the same time, and some people have said, oh, well, you see, it's really a trick. It's not a trick, I believe. You do have the idea that human beings not only form a kind of this chintzy American idea of a mosaic. I love the idea of a mosaic. A mosaic is formed of cold pieces of ceramic or stone, and they don't move. They just lie there. Life's not like that. Many societies around the world, from ancient Egypt to Yun, China, to the Khoi people of Southern Africa, life is more like a lava light. Lava light. It moves. People move. They shape. They change shape. They change color, etc. This is what has happened in Brazil. Now, the problem in Brazil, this has not been combined with economic equity or justice. Brazil is a pigmentocracy in which people who, so is the US. But in Brazil, people who are paler are higher in the socioeconomic realm, and people who are darker are lower in the socioeconomic realm. But neither is this idea that being of African descent is a curse of monkey blood that's going to last forever, for all time. It seems strange, freakish, product of a freakish and decadent society. Now, on, I believe it's Thursday of this week, I'm having lunch with a very famous colleague who works on identity and who works in Brazil, who's a European, and has written a very long article about identity and changing ideas of identity in the 21st century. And I think it's fascinating. I'm going to have to read it the second time because it's quite long. And the person is saying, well, we now have the state coming in and helping us with our identities. The state in Brazil saying who is black, who is indigenous, who lives in a quilombo, that is a person who belongs to a traditional Afro-Brazilian community, a rural one with certain legal rights now, and that now the state is beginning to help people form their identities, give them names. For instance, until around 2010, in Brazil, the term LGBTQIA was not used. It was introduced in the first administration of President Lula, the president right now. And it's a foreign term. It wasn't translated. It could have been translated into something else, but it wasn't. It was something that existed outside. It was brought in. It was Brazilianized in a way, although not really, because we're getting terms, letters that don't mean the same thing in Brazilian Portuguese. But the government began to protect identities, or, as my colleague says, project identities, which is, and he talks about two different things: protecting identity, which exists, or projecting one, that is, creating one. One can create identity, and one can protect identities which exist, but also one of the things, and this colleague is Livio Sansoni of UFBA, Federal University of Brazil, Federal University of Bahia in Brazil. Now, the question is, when you start protecting identities, how does that interact with other identities? How does that interact with class? For instance, class is important in Brazil. The economic chasm is enormous. How does that change when I change my pronouns? Or does it? Does it? How does that interact with misogyny? Misogyny exists. Misogyny discriminates. Misogyny is something that all of us know exists in almost all societies, not only those of the global north, but the global south and the east and the west. We know that. But then how does misogyny manifest itself? Since the majority of societies, women are placed in secondary positions. And how do we address misogyny and also address class? In the United States, feminism, and many people are beginning to criticize this. Historically, feminism has been connected to middle-class white women who wanted what middle-class white men wanted. It was not a particularly progressive movement. It's not progressive particularly. And there were some progressive women who said, we don't want it without social justice. Now, we need feminism. We need racial justice. We need attacks on food inequality. We need to protect the environment and its impact upon different socioeconomic groups. We need intersectionality. That's what we need. We need to come to a situation where we realize it's not just one thing or two things or three things, but these things come together, and it's not that we really privilege one over the other. So that I'm really, let's say, talking about race, and I said, oh, well, I'm talking about race. Yeah, women have some rights too, you know. But I put women secondarily, or I put LGBT rights secondarily. No, they come together in different ways at different times. And we have to be aware of how they come together and how we address them in a full spectrum way. Because if we address them piecemeal, like, oh, this is wrong, and this is bad, and this makes so-and-so cry, it's not going to work. I know people who are focused on one issue, and they focus on that issue at the expense of all others. You say, well, what about these other issues? Oh, well, yeah, they'll solve themselves. They will not solve themselves. And neither will rhetoric. We can change all kinds of things. Someone talked about the Great Cultural Revolution in China, which I remember. I wasn't in China, but I had a friend who went, who actually had been a member of the Communist Party, International Communist Party, and had gone during the Cultural Revolution, and they were going to make a new, what they call a new man, new person, they should have said. And, there was a period in which men and women were to wear the same clothes, and there was a whole push to create a new kind of being and get rid of many old things, old ways of thinking. Now, this I understand because it was created within a new class structure, a new being. It didn't quite work. You look at China today, you look at the government, you look at the politics, you look at the legislative members, it looks like a group of middle-aged bourgeois men in suits with a few women thrown in. This is not what was thought about. So how do we get societies in which identity is defined, really defined? Now, what are we talking about? Embraced, as far as we can embrace it. In other words, we embrace identity, we protect various identity groups. At the same time, we realize that underneath this is the question of economic justice. We have to realize also, as I was told someone yesterday, in a place like Great Britain, feminism was wild. British feminism threw bombs. British feminism chained themselves to Buckingham Palace. We have one film of a feminist committing suicide, carrying a banner saying, "Vote for women." And she threw herself in 1911 in front of the king's horse. It was trampled to death. Oh, we have that. But we also know that some of the same women in World War I went to the government and said that they would support spying on various people who might be pro-German. And they would include, believe it or not, there was actually a proposal by some feminists to spy on homosexuals. And that women would work double time in war industries. And women would do everything they could for the state, for king and country, as it was called, in World War I. If women, bourgeois women, got the vote. Now, some women at one point had been trying to blow things up and, harm people, and they were and starve themselves to death. A few years later, they're saying, we'll do anything. They became one identity issue people. And what happened was, they got the vote. But they got the vote on the same basis as everyone else. White working men got the vote, didn't get the vote until 1918. Middle-class women got the vote in 1930 on a class basis. This is what these middle-class feminists got. There were many, many people on the left who said, this is not what we're about. We have thousands of young girls working in factories, living in one room or living together, not eating enough, not getting enough, not warm enough. What is voting going to do for them? And what are middle-class feminists going to do for them? And there was a big split and a big discussion. So what I want to do when I think about identity is I want to see how identity connects to class identity, what we can do to make sure that class, which is one aspect of identity, fits in and works with other aspects. And so hopefully you'll have questions, I'll have questions. I'm still working on this. And I have, as some of you know at Brandeis, I have kept my pronouns. And I have worked on my pronouns to reform my pronouns. My pronoun is AYDM. And I chose that as something that I could live with and believe in. and you can use with me. So I'll say good night to you. Have a good evening. It's evening here now. The sun has gone down over the Atlantic Ocean, and I'll see you all in about a month. And I hope that all of you will have questions, because I have more questions for you. Good night.